Okay, so we are live, we're recording. So welcome everybody to the YA Thrillercon panel on how true events inspire crime fiction. So I'm here with Gila Green, Stuart Gibbon, Roehrig, Christina Hoag, for what should be a super interesting discussion. I'm your moderator, I'm Kit Mallory. I'm the author of 2 YA dystopian novels, Blackout and Sparks, which are set in a near future UK, which is a little bit too close to non-fiction these days, unfortunately. So I'm going to come to each of the panel now to introduce yourselves and tell us all a little bit about your latest books, if that's okay. So Caleb, can we kick off with you?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Roehrig, and I'm the author of The Fell of Dark. I'm sorry, I don't have one of my books with me, but I do have this giant printout of the cover. I have published 4 separate YA novels, all of which are thrillers to some degree. This one is a paranormal thriller about a teenage disaster who lives in the suburbs of Chicago. Fulton Heights is a small town with a very big vampire problem, and all Augie Pfeiffer wants to do is live long enough to graduate and move very far away, hopefully to some place where there is not a looming chance that he might get eaten. But his plans are thrown into disarray with the arrival of an annoyingly hot vampire who bears a cryptic warning. It seems Augie is the key figure in an ancient prophecy foretelling the vampire apocalypse. The problem is he doesn't know if he is destined to save the Earth or to destroy it.
Oh, that's a good twist. I like that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Caleb. Stuart, can I come to you next? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
I'll try and follow that if I can. Not easy. My name's Stuart Gibbon. My background is in policing, really. I joined the Metropolitan Police in London as a teenager, and I worked there for nearly 20 years. Then I moved away to the middle of England, where I served for a few more years. I left the police a few years ago, having served for about 32 years. And I set up my own business, really working with writers, particularly crime writers, to help them with their police procedure. Because having read a few books, I picked up 1 or 2 little areas that I thought maybe could be improved. And I know that some people that read books pick these things up and say, well, that's not right, that would never happen, and the sort of thing. So I got into that kind of line of work as a consultant. And I've been working with writers now for quite a few years, which is a really interesting job, actually. In 2015, I met a man called Stephen Wade, who's a brilliant man. He's a crime historian. And we got chatting and we decided that what would it be like if we wrote a book together about true crime? Stephen would deal with historical, so he's talking about things that happened in the 1800s and the 1900s, and I would deal with the more contemporary. So we did it and we produced a book. We've since written another couple, all about the way crime works and the mind of the people that commit crime and the impact on victims and those sort of areas. At the moment, we're writing a series of very short crime reference guides for the UK audience based on specific subjects. So our latest one that came out in November last year is called A Comprehensive Guide to Arrest and Detention. And this is basically telling you from a UK point of view exactly how things work when somebody is arrested for a crime, how it works, what happens. And then there's lots of information about what happens when you're taken to a police station, what the rights are, how long the police could hold you detention legally for, all those sort of areas, all the way through to if you were ever charged with an offence. And we're hopeful that these sort of books will help mainly crime writers, but not just crime writers. So if they're writing a story and there's something in there about somebody being arrested, they can always flick at the book, and find out how long actually the police can detain you. Because I think a lower police procedural book, if it's full of procedure, can be really quite dull. I think if the odd bits and pieces are in there, it's good if they're accurate, because it tends to get the reader more engaged in the story.
Absolutely.
So I'm kind of a consultant, and I'm writing books as well at the same time, which is really quite enjoyable. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stuart, and a really invaluable resource, I'm sure, for lots and lots of writers. Brilliant. Thank you. Christina, can we come to you next? You tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, I was a journalist for about 30 years and covered a lot of crime and trials and different things over the years in that, mostly for newspapers, magazines, print journalist. And always wanted to write books, and I've always been fascinated by crime and just the darker side of humanity, you know, why people do the things that they do, you know, and are we all in fact capable of doing these things and things like that. So I've written 2 novels, both sort of one, Skin of Tattoos, which you can see behind me, is sort of an older YA, and it was based on gang members deported from Los Angeles to El Salvador that I interviewed some years ago. And their stories sort of stayed with me. And later, when I was moved to Los Angeles and worked for the Associated Press as a reporter, I covered a lot of these gang sort of issues, prevention, intervention, city efforts to, you know, rein in the gangs. And I wanted to write the other side of it. So that's Skin of Tattoos, guy trying to get out of the gang, but finding it very difficult. And then Girl on the Brink is based sort of on my own experience in an abusive relationship, sort of a different take on crime, I suppose, and how she has to get herself out of a very difficult situation, and does have a happy ending. So, but it's another thing that police, I'm sure Stuart had to deal with many domestic violence things. It's incredibly common. So I wrote that sort of as a cautionary tale, one might say.
Yeah, really important topics, and obviously, you know, huge sort of breadth of experience there with you, sort of, yeah, your own experience, and then all of the kind of, you know, conversations you've had with other people, and yeah, all of the research you've done. It'd be really fascinating to hear more about that. Thank you so much, Christina. And last but not least, Gila, can we come to you? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your books?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and inviting me. And I feel very honored to be part of this really interesting group. I am Canadian originally, but I live in Israel right now. I have published 4 novels. I realized that all 4 of them do have a crime element. I wouldn't have called them a crime fiction per se. But in the first one, which is a futuristic, well, then it was futuristic. It's less futuristic now as the years obviously have passed. It came out in 2013, and it was taking place in, you know, 2030. So it's getting less and less. I think sort of maybe like you mentioned, kids, it's getting a little closer to reality than it was. But there is a kidnapping in that novel. And then in another novel I wrote called Passport Control in 2019, there's a murder. And the more recent one that also came out in 2019, it came out in Australia, called No Entry. The entire novel takes place in South Africa. It's an environmental young adult fiction novel, and it deals with elephant poaching and elephant extinction. So I had to do a lot of research. Maybe I should have known Stuart then. I had to do a lot of research about poachers, elephant poachers, and how do they get away with what they get away with, and how do they operate, and, you know, the whole sort of, it's a global crime demand for ivory, because to be honest, when I started, I wanted to do a book that takes place in South Africa. I didn't want to touch apartheid because I felt that the South African authors were doing a really great job and didn't need a Canadian author to impose her outsider view. So I decided I would address what struck me the most when I lived there, which was the animals that we just, you know, I sort of grew up with squirrels in Canada and rabbits and maybe a bear, but going there and going on safari and seeing elephants and all the, you know, the big 5 as they call them there. And then I thought no one poaches anymore. I thought this was completely an out-of-date thing that had been dealt with. And then when I started looking into it more and more, I realized that that was absolutely naive and wrong, and it's a massive crime industry. So that's a No Entry. And then a book that I've written that's not out yet is what I would call a real crime novel, where I do actually base on real criminals that I knew from the past who try to take over somebody's business in a, you know, in a criminal manner, in a criminal way. So I've probably been writing a lot more crime fiction than I ever realized until I got invited to this panel. I didn't actually realize that I was so into crime fiction, but I guess I am.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting to hear about all of everyone's sort of different journeys into writing crime fiction and thrillers. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about that actually. And some of you touched on it a little bit about what sort of drew you into writing crime fiction and thrillers. And Caleb, I guess yours is probably in some ways the least based on kind of true to life experience. Hopefully, there's no vampires in the town you grew up in. What was it that drew you into writing thrillers?
I don't know what you're talking about. It's all based on a true story. It's funny because when I was a little kid, the stories that I loved, it was like stories about like witches and ghosts and haunted houses, and I loved like Scooby-Doo because it was all of that. But then there was like an explanation at the end of it, and I loved fantasy too. But for some reason, I kind of grew. I won't say I grew out of fantasy because I feel like that belittles a genre. I would say that for me, I kind of grew apart from fantasy, but I never lost that love of like mysteries and monsters and stuff like that. So I just kind of like graduated into more adult versions of those stories. And I was like swiping paperbacks from my mother, and I like stay until 5 a.m. reading this story about like a serial killer. So the stories just always really appealed to me, and I can't entirely explain why. I just find it so fascinating. I think some of it too is that they're true. It's like they're frightening things that happen, and they're real things that happen, but in the sort of realm of fiction, I get to be in control of what actually is scary, which makes it less scary.
Definitely really identify with that actually, and I think fantasy can still be a real tool kind of for exploring kind of real experiences that happen to real people, but as you say, even if not everything is completely true to life, they're kind of like the human side of it, and the human emotions in it are definitely still are. So thank you so much, Caleb, that's really interesting. And can I sort of ask Christina, what was it about the kind of the topics that you were sort of drawn to write about, sort of specifically? What was it that kind of drew you into that side of the genre and made you feel like they were things you wanted to write about?
I was always fascinated by sort of gangs and people who build, small microcosm worlds within our larger society. And early on, I was assigned to interview members of the Hell's Angels, motorcycle gang. And they were delivering toys to a hospital for Christmas. This was their sort of good deed, so they were very pumped up about getting some good PR. And I go, it was in Levittown, Pennsylvania, in this small, sort of bungalow, small house there in this working class, lower middle class suburb. And all the big chopper bikes are there, and they open the door, and they've got the black leather and the long hair, out to here, and bushy, just like you see the stereotypical biker gang guys. And I sat down and talked to them and realized they were just kind of like ordinary people, and it just sort of struck me that a lot of people who commit crimes are really kind of ordinary people that somehow make these really terrible decisions, and get involved in things. But what fascinated me about them was how they had constructed this, this whole little culture, their own dress code, their own rules for living, their own sort of businesses. They were involved in the meth trade at that point. Their own modes of, they preferred these Harley Davidson motorcycles, these huge things, and, all this. So it sort of just fascinated me how people build these, in essence, tribes. Humans want to we all want to belong to a tribe, to a group. And gangs seem to gather in people who are disaffected from their families or other parts of society that we, sort of normal parts, and they form their own thing. And then they often, turn to crime to survive. So that's sort of, initiated, I think, my interest in that. It was just like, it's really interesting. Why do people get in these little huddles, and then they go on and commit these crimes and things?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's so fascinating. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's that kind of hardwired into humans, isn't it, to need to be part of a group, and we're pack animals, aren't we? We're social creatures, and that's a really fascinating way of kind of approaching the topic. Really, really interesting. Must have been really interesting to research as well, and to explore. And how about Gila? How about you? What kind of drew you into sort of those particular? Because it sounds like you've kind of, your books are on quite a few different kind of topics, but all with this kind of sort of thread of within the genre. So what is it about the genre, do you think, that it sort of appeals to you, that sort of drew you in?
I think I would say the flip side of what Christina just said. When I was growing up, I, as a very young person, saw a lot of incidents of people just get completely taken advantage of by con artists, end up penniless, end up bankrupt. So sort of the flip side, more like the victim, like how are people so, it made me very, probably for quite a while, sort of hard to get close to. I was quite suspicious of people, quite distrusting of people, because of these bad formative experiences that I had. And it made me, maybe growing up without realizing it, as I said, I only realized even when I got invited to this panel, like, what do you mean I write crime fiction? And she's like, what are you talking about? All your books have crime in them. I'm like, oh my gosh, they do. With the exception of this one that I just finished writing and, is just sitting at an agent and isn't even anywhere yet. That I deliberately wrote as crime fiction, maybe because I was going to confront some of these things that I'd experienced as a much younger person, finally actually kind of confront them. Maybe I've been masking it all along, I don't know. But more the other side of the victim. Like, why are you so naive? Why are you're so trusting? Just kind of, they do seem to, I mean, Stuart would know much more, but they seem to select a certain type of person. Even when you're talking about elephant poaching is different because it's a crime against, well, it's crime against humanity because it's crime against animals. It's a crime against an entire species. So that's a little different because obviously it's not like elephants are more naive than dogs or hippos or something like that. So that's a little bit different. That functions on people's just unbelievable greed. Just sort of the super rich will always have a demand for rare products. It just seems to be something we're not going to be able to get out. There's going to be a demand for something really rare on a very small segment of the population. So aside from that, which is more about greed, why are people so naive? Are we hardwired to be naive and trusting to be part of groups? I don't know. But there's clearly a type of person that is more preyed upon than others, even though obviously anyone can be a victim of a con artist. And that fascinates me. And trying to write such a character who isn't two-dimensional, who isn't a stereotype, is really, really challenging. So it's just very motivating because you don't want to write a flat sort of stereotype of someone who just, I don't know, she's kind of an airy person and doesn't really know what's going on. That's not that at all. That's not how those people come off. But somehow they're prey over and over again. And can I do it? Can I successfully write a victim who isn't a flat kind of, well, I knew she was gonna, get taken. It was a very big challenge for me. And I guess I just liked it. I still haven't, I can't say I've cracked it. What's with this naivete? But I will keep trying.
Thank you. And it's so fascinating, all the different angles to kind of approach the genre from. And, it's one of the sort of magical things about fiction, isn't it? Is there's a room for everything, and they're all so important. There are all these different experiences and all the different, different sort of perspectives and different roles people play in these stories. They're all equally important to kind of explore and understand. So, yeah, amazing to hear everybody kind of coming from such different angles on it. Stuart, can I ask you? You mentioned that there are a few books that you've read that you thought maybe that's not quite right. Do you read much crime fiction, or do you just find that you can't bear it because you had so much of your own experience? Or are there any books that are sort of particularly realistic or compelling to you, sort of based on your professional experience?
Yeah, I do read crime fiction. I probably don't read as much as I should do. I tend to alternate between crime fiction and true crime. So I might read a fiction book one week and then I'll pick a true crime book. I like to read the true crime books about professionals like forensic scientists. I find all that sort of thing fascinating, how they go about their work, trying to help to solve crimes. Crime fiction wise, Yeah, there have been one or two when I initially started reading them where you think, that's not quite. But I appreciate it's really difficult for a writer because you've got to engage the reader. It's got to be exciting. It's got to have a twist in it. It's got to keep them engaged. And sometimes if it's not procedurally bang on, it's not the end of the world. I think it's only where it's really unrealistic, where you think, well, that's never, ever going to happen. And they're few and far between, the ones that I've seen. But it's a difficult challenge for the writer, particularly if they haven't got any experience of the procedural side, because they're not going to know. And you can do a certain amount of research, maybe online and that sort of thing, but it's never always bang up to date. And, there's dangers in that as well. I just wanted to mention a couple of books from my perspective that are fiction books that really kind of grabbed me, partly because of what they're about. They're really kind of, you mentioned the word compelling, and for me they are. They're both UK based and they're both relatively recent books. The first one is called The Girl in the Missing Poster, and it's a fiction book by a lady called Barbara Copperthwaite, who's based in the Midlands in the UK. And this was a fascinating book for me because it's about someone that goes missing. And when I get asked questions from crime writers and other writers, an awful lot are about people that go missing. It may turn into a murder or some crime, or they may turn up again, hopefully safe and well. But a lot of the time, there's a missing person in there. So I was fascinated with this book. And when I started to get through it, I was even more kind of intrigued because it's actually about a twin that goes missing. I think probably I won't give too much away in case anybody wants to read it. But there are two lady twins who are kind of 19, 20 years old. There's a family party, and one of them just disappears, completely disappears, no trace. And the other one takes up the kind of mantle to try and find her. And she's putting posters up around town and does anybody know where my sister is? And it's just the fact that the impact on this twin, it's almost like losing a limb kind of thing. Just disappeared. She has no idea. And it's fascinating. And I just read the research that this lady, Barbara Copperthwaite, had done, and the fact that there is something called the Lone Twins Network, which it's probably global, but it's certainly in the UK, where people who have lost a twin, either through a tragic, bereavement, or they've just disappeared or been the victim of a crime, they can get together and kind of talk about their loss and try and support each other. So I was fascinated by this book, just because it comes at a kind of different angle, and it is relatively realistic because there are, of course, across the world, so many people that do go missing, and a proportion of those are actually tragically never found. So that was one that kind of really stuck with me. The other one is kind of slightly different and really tragic, but it's called Safe and Sound, and it's by a lady called Philippa East. It's her second book, and it's based kind of on a real case, an absolutely heartbreaking case of a lady called Joyce Vincent. Now, Joyce was in her 30s and she lived in London in a flat above a shopping centre. And she had friends and family. She kept in touch with them, but there was a point in time where she stopped contact with them all. Nobody could kind of work out why that was. It was fascinating when Christina earlier on mentioned domestic abuse, because actually Joyce was a victim of domestic abuse in her life. And at one point she had to go to a refuge because she was so frightened about a certain individual tracking her down. Cut a long story short, and again, without spoiling it, the basic story of Joyce Vincent is that she died in this flat in her 30s. And the kind of amazing thing in this day and age in London or in any city or town in the world is that her body wasn't found for more than 2 years. And she was only found when the bailiffs went round with the housing association people because she owed so much money in unpaid rent. And they found her. Obviously, she died more than 2 years before. It's such a tragic case. But it's beautifully written, and it's written in such a way that it makes you think about kind of, how can this happen? Surely somebody must have been trying to get in touch with her. Didn't the neighbours realise what was going on? And it's an absolutely heart-wrenching book, but it's a very, very powerful book to read. So those two I thought I'd kind of mention because they're not the obvious crime book that you'd think of, but they've got elements in them of personal tragedy and the background to it, which I think really makes a book sometimes.
And all the more powerful for that, it sounds like. And yeah, thank you for that, Stuart. It sounds like there's something about that kind of human experience, human connection, that it really kind of makes sort of stand apart, which I think is what a lot of you are sort of saying. Really, there's something about really understanding that sort of individual experience, and how that translates on a sort of wider level to to lots of people, that really is kind of really compelling. Caleb, I wanted to ask you, have you kind of borrowed at all from sort of real life events, sort of people, sort of real stories to kind of sort of inspire your work at all?
Yeah, actually, I have. It's interesting because I feel like, every few years it seems like there's a major crime that really kind of gets a lot of media attention and captures the imagination of the world. But for me, and it's funny because a lot of the ones that really interest me are older, like unsolved crimes from, say, like the 40s and 50s and 30s. Like the longer ago it is, the more intrigued I am by the fact that it remains unsolved. I actually, in my debut, I can't give away too many details because it would reveal a twist, but I was watching a true crime program with my mother, and there was a story about a missing person. And there was a detail in there that I thought, I was like, that is so diabolical and so fascinating. And so I ended up using that I sort of adapted it a little bit, but I used that as a twist in my debut, because I don't know, I find some of that stuff is the way that the human mind works is really intriguing. And yeah, like I said, I actually do have several stories that I have not yet written, but that are inspired by some of these unsolved mysteries from the past. And a book that I would recommend to readers is Megan Abbott's The Song Is You, which is sort of a fictionalized, it is a fictionalized detective story about the true life disappearance of Jean Spangler, who is an actress who vanished in the, I want to say it was the late 40s, it might have been the early 50s, but it's about a journalist who looks into her disappearance and tracks her down. It's really fascinating. I thought it was brilliantly done.
I love Megan Abbott. She's one of my favorite crime authors.
Yeah,
Is she American?
She's amazing. Sorry?
Is she American?
Yeah.
Yes.
I need to make a list of all these.
Literary style, rather than procedural. It's more literary kind of.
Amazing. I need to make a list of all these recommendations. They all sound amazing.
I've jotted down Stuart and.
Absolutely. One thing I'm interested in is when you're sort of fictionalizing or borrowing from sort of real life events and real life people, real people's stories. What kind of things do you need to sort of take into account, sort of bearing in mind that these are things that have happened to real people? How do you handle sort of potential sensitivities around like fictionalizing those stories? Christina, can I come to you first to sort of answer that?
Yeah, well, that was a consideration when I wrote Girl on the Brink. It's not really based on my own story, but it was inspired by, and one of the reasons I wrote it as a young adult was to do that, was to completely sort of separate it from my reality, because the last thing I wanted was this guy to come back at me, and he'd already proved himself very litigious. So I looked up, how do you do this? And basically you have to kind of just, change name, obviously, physical characteristics, profession, the setting. I made it set in New Jersey, where I ended up in high school, a fictional town in New Jersey. The age was teenagers, gave them completely different looks, and that kind of thing. But the situations were sort of in parallel, but not exactly the same. So I stuck to the script, but sort of just, removed it, I guess you would say, a little bit. So it wasn't quite on target.
Yeah. So the character wasn't sort of recognizable as the same person. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the key, and is to make them not, so somebody who reads that wouldn't recognize, who knows the person wouldn't read it. That's what a publishing attorney told me. He said, you want to just make it that little bit.
Yeah.
Christina, did you find it helped you to write that book in terms of your own kind of personal thoughts and feelings, or did you find it a real challenge to almost like relive some of what you'd actually experienced before?
Yeah, a bit of both, actually. It was very helpful, and I really felt strongly about it. And there are definite red flags of an abusive relationship, and just what Gila was saying about picking your marks. That's exactly what abusers do. They look for certain things. They're very uncannily they're basically like con artists, and they have this uncanny sort of intuition about people, who would fall for them. So I wanted to sort of write a bit about sort of a cautionary tale, these red flags, because nobody teaches people these in school or anywhere else in life. But once you know what they are, they're very apparent. You can spot them. So that's what I sort of did. I wanted to write these red flags, but at the same time, I did have to relive it. It was good in that I wanted to finish it quickly. I'm like, all right, I've got to do this. Get through this draft and get through it. But yeah, it was a helpful experience, sort of a cathartic, therapeutic experience.
Yeah, that sounds, thank you for sharing that. And I can imagine it must have been really hard, but also really important to have that, because I think that sometimes with people in really difficult situations like abusive relationships, you can kind of feel like it's just you're the only person going through this, and actually they're being like you say, you don't get taught about these things, but there being books out there where you can see your own experience reflected and realize that it's not just you, and it's not just you that's happened to, and other people have been in the same situation. There's something so powerful about that, isn't there? And what about with kind of characters, sort of where maybe you're not directly involved in the story, but you've heard someone else's story and you're kind of writing about that, for if that makes sense. So I'm thinking about the kind of the Skin of Tattoos, and how you sort of interviewed lots of other people, and I guess some of their stories must have made it into the book in some ways. Are there sort of different considerations when you're kind of coming at it from that perspective?
Sort of the same thing. I mean, like one guy I interviewed in El Salvador, his brother was a policeman. So one guy was a gang member and deported for committing crimes, and his brother was a policeman. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I wanted to include that, but I didn't stick to it quite the same. I wanted to make a difference. So I made him a fireman instead of a policeman. So, not quite the same, sort of parallel, but sort of, So I just trying to change circumstances just that little bit, but trying to keep in the spirit of it, but just changing different aspects of the character.
I would assume that sort of like the smaller and less sensationalized the crime is, the more careful you have to be about how you represent it. Because I feel like, there are some of these cases like Amanda Knox or John Benet Ramsey, where people have written so many different versions of those stories, so many crime fiction stories inspired by scenarios exactly like that, where you can see the inspiration in them. And I think something that has been so sensationalized in the media, it becomes a little bit more fair game. But when you are talking about something that has been less publicized, you run the risk of exploiting somebody's grief or putting details out there that somebody doesn't want revealed. So then I would think you need to tread a little more carefully. But some of those much bigger stories are a little more up for grabs, I'd say.
Yeah, they're in the public domain, they call the public domain, so you're sort of free to write about them. Anything that's appeared sort of in the press is fair game, I would say. But,
but a big responsibility still, I think, as Caleb says, that you're kind of writing about someone's real experience, in the way that you kind of represent that and sort of explore that, and particularly if they are, they might come across that story at some point, if it's kind of contemporary.
That's what I was going to say, that I refer to it when that sort of thing is discussed as the 2 R's. So responsibility, responsible writing, the way you write it, and respect for the people that have been impacted by that crime, victims, family, loved ones. And as long as you bear those things in mind, I think, and you won't go too far wrong, I don't think.
Absolutely. Really good point, Stuart. Thank you. Gila, how about you? because I mean, you spoke about this kind of a lot of your writing, in some ways being sort of influenced by your own experience and the experiences of kind of people you've met, people you've known. What kind of was it a sort of conscious thing, when you sort of writing about sort of experiences that are kind of close to you, or that you've sort of been in sort of other people's stories that you've heard, or were there any sort of things you had to take into consideration kind of writing those stories?
Right. So the books that Passport Control, where there's a murder and No Entry with the poaching, those are not based on they're entirely fictional. So that was far easier, and I relied a lot on old newspapers, YouTube. You've got to sit and watch. You have to get it right. Again, like you said, sensitively. How do South African police act? What would they say is very different than, a policeman in England or the UK or I mean, anywhere, Canada, whatever. So I relied a lot on newspapers and articles and videos that I watched of arrests when they're actually arresting poachers, watching them. I had a lot of maps. And the same with the murder that takes place in Jerusalem and the old city, and I relied a lot on media, actual crimes that had happened, and then taking elements and making that really well. So that was actually relatively easy because you're much more emotionally just, this didn't happen, So in a way, it's more your own challenge, but you're not. The book that I just finished, that hopefully will be out. That was based on much more of a real experience, but I was far younger. When you hear family stories, if you're really very young, let's say under the age of 10, you might hear a zillion different versions. You're not really, weren't really old enough, even if you were physically there, you weren't really old enough necessarily to. So you're relying on a lot of people's versions, which in a way is helpful because then it is fictionalized in a way. You're not really, but yeah, I had to be careful. I certainly didn't want to make the people who were, completely duped feel badly that they were so duped, because that wasn't the point. The point was exploring con men. I generally have a fascination with con artists and people who get conned, and just conning in general, and why it works so well over and over and over again on so many different levels. So yes, I modified things. I made the crime less. I also was young adult, so I didn't want it to be too, like in real life, there might have been a lot more drugs involved, much harder drugs involved. I took all that right out or made it sort of ambiguous. I wanted it to be appropriate, maybe like Christina's been saying, maybe we should talk about it more. Maybe young adults should be more aware of these signs. So I didn't want to have too many heavy elements that certain, parents wouldn't want their kids to read it. Because of the age group. So I did take out some of the harsher things. And yes, I did try to modify and be very sensitive, because it's not, it's not a haha, you were such a loser novel or anything like that. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. How could I sort of think how this could have happened? So yes, you reduce it and you play with it. And I tried to humanize the criminals as well. That was the point. I didn't want flat 2D criminals. I wanted, how does this person become a con man? Why is he doing this? Why does he go around trying to, rip people off and destroy their lives? Why is that okay with him? And to sort of portray him in a way that you could understand how, he would think that is okay on some level. So yeah, it's very different if there's a true element than if it's completely fictionalized.
Absolutely. It's a really good point about, the portrayal of villains as well, because they are human beings too. And yeah, like you say, it's really important that they're also not kind of just two-dimensional, but they're sort of understood as kind of full people. So that must be a really interesting sort of dual perspective to write from. Thank you. Stuart, I wanted to ask, do you see any kind of common mistakes in crime fiction? Like things that, is there anything that really makes you think like, oh no, like that's really not realistic, or things that maybe some of us who kind of aren't in the profession would think are realistic, but really aren't? Is there anything that, as writers we need to kind of look out for?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because a lot of people's perceptions are based on either what they've read or often what they've seen on TV. So if you watch lots of crime fiction on TV, you'll see the detective, in the UK in particular, you'll see the detective that's running the murder, for example, doing everything. I mean everything. You know, they're chasing after the suspect, they detain the suspect, take him back to the station, then they're interviewing him. Well, in reality, none of that really happens. I used to be in charge of murder cases for quite a few years in the UK, and my kind of interviewing a suspect, those days ended several years before because you don't actually do it. So when you see a detective in charge interviewing the suspect, certainly in the UK, it never happens. Now, unless you know that, obviously you're gonna write it, because the difficulty is often the main characters in a book are the lead detective, so they don't want them sitting behind a computer doing paperwork, because that's not very exciting, and the reader's going to just bin the book. So they want them chasing around. So it's really a balancing act. I would say that's probably one of the things, and also the way, if you've got characters in there that are police officers, particularly UK, the way that they engage and talk to each other or with each other, it's very informal in the UK. So you'd use first name terms. So there's none of this shouting and bawling and using last names, and ranks are never used. Nobody will refer to somebody by their rank. It just doesn't happen. But of course, unless you know that, then that's one of the common things that I see in some people's books, that it's not the end of the world, but people who read it who do know these things might think, well, actually, I might not read the next book because there's this wrong and that's wrong. So it's just it's a kind of learning process really for the writer. And like I said earlier on, you don't want too much procedure in the book, because it can be very dull. But if you just put a little bit in here and now, the odd phrase, the odd comment, the odd abbreviation, if it's right, people will recognize that, and it just adds a bit of authenticity to the book itself, really.
I have a question for Stuart. Do they really say gov? Do they call it in all the British TV shows? They're always saying right gov or right gaff.
That's a brilliant
do they say
question.
that?
That's a brilliant question, and the answer is yes, they do.
Oh, they do. Okay.
Yeah, if you have a senior officer, normally it's CID, detective,
right,
plain clothes, they'll either be called sir or ma'am, depending on etc., or they might be called boss. Boss is a common one, and the other one is gov, short for governor.
Just say gov.
So, yeah, gov is a very popular term. It's a kind of slang term, but you will hear officers of a junior rank referring to their boss as gov quite often. So I can understand why you think it's probably not right, but actually that's one of the things that is spot on. Yeah, it is.
I thought it must be, because it's so widespread and I love British police shows, so I watch a lot of them, and I'm like, oh, they must really say that. But I just wanted to ask you, is that really the? Yeah,
they do.
Seems such an old-fashioned sort of a thing.
It's a lot more informal, even between the junior and senior ranks. It's a lot more informal than people realise. It's not like the military or anything like that. There is an element of respect, but it's, I guess, because of the type of job they do, it's a little bit more kind of informal and relaxed inside the organisation than some people would perceive. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you. Caleb, what kind of research do you find yourself doing for your work, with the kind of straddle sort of real life and fantasy?
Oh my gosh, I research a little bit of everything. I like to tell people, basically, you spend an hour, I will open 15 tabs on my computer, and I'm, referencing this, that, and the other in order to write a paragraph on the page that I will later delete entirely when I'm revising, because it ends up not being important or it's too many words. It's agonizing, because I feel like all I need to do is get one thing wrong, and somebody's gonna be like, "This is trash." So, it's like I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I know nothing about everything. So I am constantly trying to figure out police ranks and police procedure and legal procedure and sort of jurisdictional stuff, and then science stuff. And if it's a historical fiction, that adds an extra layer of, what kind of clothing do people wear, what kind of products do they wear, how much did they cost, what was, all this stuff that I understand about contemporary living, how was that different back then? And how were things sort of more informal? Because, of course, we have a lot of regulations now that didn't exist back then because of the stuff that happened back then, and so on and so forth. So there's a ton of research that goes into it. For the fantasy elements, a lot of that is much more relaxed because it is fantasy. So there is less of like an established rule. And because I had vampires in my novel, that research process was much more along the lines of, I got to look at the vast breadth of vampire fiction literature and film and television that has existed over the course of over 100 years now in popular, I mean, like, of course, vampire lore dates back centuries, but the first vampire novel was Carmilla, which I think was late 19th century. And so there has been in popular fiction, the vampires existed for just over 100 and some odd years. But there are so many different versions of that I could kind of pick and choose what worked for me and kind of craft the fill in the blanks with the stuff that I needed in order for it to be there. But even then it becomes a challenge for me because my brain, I deal so much more with sort of like concrete facts and details. I find it so much easier to build a world with those building blocks. When it comes to fantasy, suddenly I've got to remember all these imaginary rules and I can't contradict my own imaginary rules. It's really easy to write a book that doesn't contradict the rules of the known universe because we know it. And if I don't know something, it's pretty easy to look it up. But with fantasy, I'm like, I can't remember can these things fly? I can't remember. I think I wrote that on page 70, but I don't see it. So it's sometimes it's harder to keep track of the things that I invented rather than the things that already exist.
Yeah, I definitely really relate to that kind of when someone says, well, how does this work? And you're like, I don't know because I haven't made it up yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say to Caleb that actually you can find vampire reference in the Bible as well, way farther back than 100 years is like nothing in the, certainly.
All right.
I don't know if you're how familiar you are with biblical stories, but Esav and his twin brother Jacob and Esav, they were twins when they Yaakov and Esav, I guess Jacob in English, right? When they meet and he says that he bites his neck, and in the actual biblical story, his neck supposedly a miracle happens and it turns to marble so that he can't actually hurt him. But in other I'm trying to think of the English word for like in other interpretations, commentaries, in other commentaries on that scene where the brothers reunite, they haven't seen each other for a long time, and he bites his neck. There's questions of whether or not he's a vampire. Is Esav a vampire? If you Google is Esav a vampire, you'll get
fascinating.
Or a werewolf. You'll get some interesting stuff. So you can go.
Yeah, totally fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, they're twins, and you can do a lot. And there's no conclusive answer. It's not like they're actually saying that he is, but I'm saying the references to werewolves and vampires are much farther back than a century.
That is fascinating. I feel like we've all just learned something new from the looks on all our faces. Thank you, Gila. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So something I'm really curious about is, for all of you, are there any true life like events that you'd like to write about that you've maybe like got in your back pocket but you've not written about yet, or anything that you think is really fascinating but is like a bit too like almost like stranger than fiction, like even though it was a real story, it might be hard to write a sort of convincing fiction about? Is there anything like that for any of you?
I just watched this Netflix show, The White Serpent. It was a series about a real serial killer who preyed on backpackers in Southeast Asia, I guess in the 70s, I think it was, 70s or 80s, long time. And now he's in prison, and he finally got caught. He's in prison, I think, in India or Burma or somewhere like that. Anyway, and it just fascinated me because I've been a backpacker, and I backpacked mainly around Latin America, South America, and I've always wanted to write something, set in those places and different places I've traveled. And I thought, oh, maybe this is the way I could, do something like that, some sort of serial killer or predator on backpackers around South America, use that as the setting. So that got my creative juices going. I've written it down in my little notebook, idea notebook.
Oh, yeah, that sounds absolutely terrifying. Also fascinating. So
Yeah.
that'll be one to watch out for. How about you, Gila?
I haven't had a chance to delve into it because I just finished this one, which goes back so much to the past, to the 1970s and 80s. But I would really like to, just speaking of teens and what maybe they should be taught, which as Christina said, that nobody is, just kind of this cyber crime. I recently was teaching. I teach English at university, but also for a while I was teaching at a police academy here, and people from the cyber unit, and the amount of crime that goes on. Unfortunately, girls, things that happen to them, meeting people on Instagram, on other social media, that they're so really young girls. They get them when they're very naive, 12, 13, 14, pretending to be agents looking for bathing suit models, etc., to get them to send photos. I think maybe because of my, that's not my generation, but it certainly is my kids, and I would like to be able to write something that does explore more of the crimes that we didn't have. We didn't have growing up. We didn't have phones that a pedophile could track us and ask us to meet us at a cafe and that kind of thing. I would like to do something more modern that way with what's going on for teenagers. I think it's really important.
Absolutely, super important. It'd be a big adjustment, as you say, from moving from writing something kind of set in the 70s, 80s to the kind of things that are going on now. That sounds super fascinating. How about you, Caleb? Anything sort of anything any ideas you've got sort of kicking around?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, there are two unsolved mysteries that have always really intrigued me. There was one, and I cannot remember the man's name now. But it's a real life kind of locked room murder mystery about a man who's found dead in his home. He was seated in his favorite chair. He'd been shot through the head. The bullet had been retrieved and placed on the table next to him. And the murderer had to have committed the crime in it was like a 20-minute window between when the maid left and the mailman arrived. Or maybe it was the opposite. It was when between the mailman dropping off the mail and then the maid arriving for the day, because he had taken the mail in. So whoever it was that killed him had been let in. It was somebody that he knew, who knew exactly how much time he had to kill him before the maid came home. But they never found the perpetrator, and it always has really intrigued me. And the other one is the death of William Desmond Taylor, who was a film director in Hollywood in the very, very early days. He was murdered in 1922, and among the suspects included a child star, or a former child star, and then her mother, who was kind of this kind of stage mom type. Also never solved. Very intriguing. There have been multiple theories about it, and multiple people have claimed to have solved it, but I don't think it has ever been conclusively established who killed him. But another really, really interesting kind of locked room story. I always like
amazing. They both sound absolutely fascinating.
Or to fictionalize what you mean to fictionalize what you think happened?
Yeah, I would love to sort of take the elements and sort of come up with my own explanation for how that crime or a crime like it, because not knowing all the players involved, I would of course have to kind of create my own characters to sort of fit those archetypes. But I would love to sort of come up with an explanation for how this could have happened.
That sounds amazing. Definitely keep an eye out for that. That sounds brilliant. And how about you, Stuart? What's up next for you? Do you have anything sort of in the pipeline in terms of kind of next books or?
Yeah, we've got one publishing next month, which is another one of those reference books that I mentioned earlier. That's about specific topics. It's a bit different actually, because it's about alcohol-related crime and violence. So it's something that's quite topical, unfortunately, at the moment. So it talks about drinking and driving, crimes that are committed when somebody has been drinking, and also things to do with public disorder like rioting and protests. So it's pretty topical in terms of those sort of areas. And then we're hoping to write another book towards, well, I'm going to start it in a couple of months' time. And I think we haven't quite announced what that's going to be, but it's going to be a big, large book, and it's going to cover some interesting crime areas. So we're hopefully going to make a start on that. But we're going to carry on with this team of, the way we write it is Steve does the historical. He knows lots of cases, and he uses the cases from, as Caleb mentioned earlier on there, from the 1920s and the 1890s and things like that, either solved or unsolved. And he talks about them, and I obviously bring it more up to date. So we're going to continue with that because it seems to work, and it interests writers because there's procedure in there as well. There's lots of case studies, but also because the true crime genre is so huge, kind of globally, we tend to get quite a bit of interest there as well. So it covers two sort of different areas. So that's our plans at the moment, and just carry on with the advice as long as people want it. Really, I enjoy it, and I say it's rewarding for me, and hopefully it helps the writers as well.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. So just before we finish, we'd just like to come to each of you all and just one piece of advice for any sort of would-be crime writers out there, on sort of researching true crime or kind of writing crime novels based on, or thriller novels based on real stories. Is there one piece of advice you could give to someone hoping to write a story like that? What would it be? Christina, I'm going to pick on you first, if that's okay.
I would say just read widely, which I would say, about any writer, but read the genre widely, as much as you can, different types of things and different styles. Just read a lot.
Always excellent advice. Thank you. And Gila, how about you?
Well, I would say, in addition to obviously the research and the reading and maps and that, maybe because my first degree is in journalism as well, I always try to interview at least one person, even for the most minute things. Like I, for example, personally have never held or fired a gun. Canada, guns are not a big thing, or they weren't, certainly when I was growing up there. So I would make a point. You can research it, you could see so much, you can see, YouTube's exactly, but to really, I would call around and really ask people, what was it like the first time you fired a gun? Really get into like, what did it smell like? Was it heavy? How did you stand? And it's amazing. And you can actually, you'll end up, if you probe enough, you'll end up actually being able to even use some of what they say in your actual dialogue. Like, oh, I can't believe how heavy this is, or this or that, or, what would be realistic? Would it be realistic that in a shooting range that you would be this distance apart? Really try to be as detail-oriented as possible, but try to actually interview a person if you can, and not just rely on, sometimes you can't, but if you can do that extra work, I would really recommend interviewing people. I interview people for all of my novels.
Such great advice. Thank you, Gila. And Stuart, how about you? One quick piece of advice for crime writers out there?
I think I'd say don't feel compelled to put lots of procedure in your book, because you don't have to. But if you do put something in, do everything you can to try and make sure that it's right.
Good advice. Thank you. And finally, Caleb, so come to you last.
I'm actually going to suggest that people read outside the genre as well. I picked up so much really valuable information and kind of like valuable tools as a writer from reading outside of my preferred genre. For instance, I really developed my skills writing love scenes from reading food memoirs, because the language that people use to describe food is so sensuous, and I find some of that, I was like, oh wow, I was like, this is actually kind of erotic the way that they're describing this meal. So I find that very useful, but also memoirs just in general give you a really interesting and fascinating insight into the nonfiction experiences of real people, and especially if you're reading about, if you want to set a book in a time period or in a field that is not really your lived experience. If you read a memoir from somebody who did, you will learn so much. I read a really fascinating memoir of a federal, like an FBI agent who was investigating art crimes, and I found that, just because I find art crime fascinating in general, and that really opened my eyes to it. Like, gave me a lot of valuable information about not just FBI procedure, but also crime in general, and sort of the realities of crime rather than sort of how it is sensationalized in fiction and in television.
Amazing. That's really good advice, actually. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Okay, amazing. That is us out of time for today. So once again, Caleb Roehrig, Stuart Gibbon, Gila Green, and Christina Hoag, thank you all for an incredibly interesting discussion. It's been so much fun just hanging out with you all. So next up today is an interview with Matt Killeen, who's the author of Orphan Monster Spy, followed by a live Q&A. So definitely tune into that. And we still have a full schedule of events this afternoon and tomorrow, which you can check out at yathrillercon.co.uk. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.